Good afternoon, everybody. Give people a chance to sit down. Thank you. I want to welcome you all here to the Tanner Lecture on Human Values. Being here together is quite special for, I think, all of us because we've not been able to gather for this lecture for several years. And it's a special treat to be able to welcome all of you, but I also want to give a special welcome to Mark Matheson, who's joining us here today. Mark, you can wave. Mark is the director of the Tanner Lectures on Human Values. He convenes us, he brings us all together, and creates the kind of community which doesn't happen very often in terms of bringing university presidents together. These lectures were actually established in the other Cambridge, as I like to say, at Cambridge University, in 1978. I just wanted to make sure I got the date right. And each year, the 9 participating universities in the United States and abroad sort of gather together. And when I say the universities, it's the presidents and partners or spouses who play a very important role in these conversations. And we gather together to talk about what these lectures are about, what they should be about, how we can think about human values, and how we are each approaching it on our own campuses. It's actually quite a lively conversation. So those are basically the first half of our meetings. Meetings go on for a day and a half or so. And then what we do is that we gather together, again with spouses who participate in all of these discussions. And we gather without agenda, and we talk about whatever comes to mind for all of us. Frequently, we talk about the issues that animate these lectures, but we also talk about the great issues that are confronting higher education, what's happening in the world and how it's affecting us on our campuses, how we are each approaching things and what we can each learn from each other. How, as couples, for those of us who have significant others, we experience these most interesting jobs, some might say crazy jobs. And I think what's also interesting is that as of next year, the Ivy League, the 8 institutions in the Ivy League, 6 of them will be led by women. And so we actually have a very good gender diversity of this group of university presidents. And I think that makes for very, very interesting discussions. So these lectures are named for a pretty remarkable person, and that was Obert Tanner. Obert lived in Utah originally, and he was a very successful entrepreneur and businessman. But he was deeply interested in the humanities and wanted to bring people together to think about how we can use scholarship, how we think about these issues to really reflect on the human endeavor and hopefully make progress in thinking about how we do that. He bequested, if you will, his fortune to endow these lectures. And not just these lectures, but to support libraries and other things which are essential to humanists. I always say libraries are to humanists what laboratories are to scientists. And Obert understood this deeply. Actually, one of the fountains that you will see outside the Science Center, and if you haven't seen it before, you should look for it. It's actually a beautiful fountain right in the front of it, is dedicated to Obert Tanner. So he actually lives in many ways on our campus. I'd actually like to quote him to tell you, how he thought about higher education and how he thought about the humanities. A search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values This understanding may be pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of personal and social life. I actually think that's a wonderful summary of how we think about this discipline, but also about the functions of a university more broadly. And you know, one has to ask the question, where else in the world do we bring people together to explore ideas for the sake of those ideas, to pursue scholarship simply out of curiosity in helping to understand the world we live in, how it works, how we understand it, how we communicate our values to future generations. So I want to thank the Harvard Tanner Committee, who we bring together every year to determine who will be the next Tanner lecturer. This committee is chaired by Susie Clark, who is a professor of music. These lectures have been in this hall for many, many years before Susie chaired this committee. And Susie is also the director of the Mahindra Center for Humanities at Harvard. So without further ado, Susie, I'm going to turn things over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, President Backo, Larry, as I always call you, for your support and encouragement for these lectures. I also want to greet Mark Matheson, the director of the Tanner Lectures, for your support, and he's here with us today, along with members of his team. And indeed, greetings to all of you joining us today. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the 2023 Tanner Lectures at Harvard University, featuring Margaret Redsteer, who will be talking to us on the topic of climate futures and structural paradigms. Professor Redsteer, it's an absolute great pleasure to have you here at Harvard. Now, before I introduce Professor Redsteer, let me also take a moment to thank the members of the committee and other people who made these lectures possible. In the true spirit of the Tanner Lectures, where the idea is to bring our community together to think about human values, the committee members came from across Harvard, that is, including the Harvard Business School, the Law School, the Divinity School, and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. So I'm grateful to all of the committee members. I'm also grateful to Steve Beal, the Executive Director of the Mahindra Humanities Center, and Mary McKinnon, the Events Coordinator, and the rest of the outstanding team at the Mahindra Center. I also express my gratitude to Kimberly Tseko from the President's Office and to Beth Mullins and Nancy Schaffman in the Music Department. And now to our guest of honor. We are gathered here to hear from Margaret Redsteer. She is a research scientist who has worked in both academic and government settings. She currently teaches in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington Bothell. Prior to that, she served as a research scientist for the US Department of the Interior and United States Geological Survey based in the Flagstaff Science Center, where she worked on various kinds of issues for the Navajo Nation. Now, of course, her work being, especially from her time in the US Department of the Interior, is publicly available in a numerous sets of reports that she was both a researcher and co-authored in. And these include a variety of topics, but they also include numerous geological maps of the Navajo, the Apache, and the Coconino counties in northern Arizona. Now, these geological maps, which are both feature the sort of bedrock and the surficial landscapes, provide information on plant and animal studies, flood control, water resource investigations, and especially the hazards of sand dune mobility due to aeolian or wind activity. I have to bring in the word aeolian, I love it so much. And what I want to emphasize in this is that Margaret Redsteer focuses in particular on how Indigenous populations are often restricted to arid and semi-arid lands, coping with and in the harshest landscapes. And one of the striking features about Margaret Redsteer's work is that she combines scientific study, or let's say scientific data, with insights about the palpable impacts of climate change and environmental hazards that can be felt on the human scale of experience. In other words, she traces changes experienced from one season to the next, or 1 year to the next, or in a matter of decades or centuries. So, for example, she's traced the climate impacts on fish distribution and plant species, which serve as foods, as well as the various health impacts of climate change. She's additionally studied how, for example, exposure to increased heat during outdoor ceremonies affects Indigenous populations. In other words, she has a depth of experience in bringing together Indigenous knowledge and scientific data while addressing the inequities of how climate change affects marginalized populations, agriculture, grazing, as well as infrastructure. So Margaret Redsteer, you really are the ideal Tanner lecturer as you bring together the sciences, history, culture, and public service. After her lecture today, we will be joined by Clint Carroll, who comes to us from the University of Colorado Boulder, where he's associate professor and the associate chair of graduate studies at the Ethnic Studies Department. Professor Carroll is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and he's the author of the book Roots of Our Renewal, Ethnobotany and Cherokee Environmental Governance. He's also co-editor of the Cambridge University Press series, Elements in Indigenous Environmental Research, and much besides, but I want to emphasize that his research expertise ranges from Native American environmental knowledge, practices and justice, political ecology, Indigenous governance, tribal natural resource management, social ecological health, Indigenous land education, and Cherokee studies. He has received numerous honors and awards that both honor his scholarship and his influence in land conservation and the perpetuation of land-based knowledge and ways of life, notably with the Cherokee people in Oklahoma. Now, before I hand things over to Margaret, I just want to say a few words about the schedule of the Tanner events over the next 2 days. So this afternoon, of course, we hear the first lecture of two, and today we will hear Clint Carroll's response, and then we will have it open to questions. Tomorrow at the same time and the same place, we will hear the second lecture, so I hope you will join us for that as well. And now, one final word about the room that you are in. You cannot fail to see that listed around here are rooms of names of Western composers of classical music. These names were put there at a time when these were thought to be the indelible names of music history. Part of the purpose of the Tanner lectures this week is for us to think about these kinds of histories and who told them and who didn't get to tell them. We will hear about absences in data, and we will hear about absences in interpretation of other data. So I wish to end my remarks where many nowadays often begin, and that is that we are on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts people. And our conversations this week lend us an opportunity to rethink how we articulate our human values. And with that, it is my great honor to thank you, Margaret Redsteer, and to welcome you to the podium.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me? So the topic of my lecture this evening is on resilience, a capacity to absorb disturbances and shocks. And I chose this topic because we are now living in an era of a changing climate. You may have heard over the past week that we had a record year last year in the amount of heat being recorded in the the oceans around the globe. We know that we are seeing more intense storms, and we are also facing more extreme droughts and heat waves. And so these are some of the things that we must think about when we think about living in the 21st century. It will require imagining what the significant changes of our climates could portend. And this means thinking of ways about how we adapt and how we build resilience, but also about how communities who have inherent resilience might maintain it. Rather than sustainability, resilience is now the common word used in marketing and promotion. It's associated with online gaming and with computing, stock portfolios, and narratives about healthcare, and rescue and nonprofits for building materials and contracts. And these are in addition to the governments and NGOs that are addressing disaster management and planning for climate change. Widespread embracing of this term indicates a perception that people are seeking resilience as an inherent property of an object or a group to hold up under stress. Resilience is central to the many ways that Indigenous knowledge is practiced by Native people. This is broader in scope than conventional science and includes accounts and histories sometimes at odds with archaeological, anthropological, and mainstream historical texts. Additionally, there are hierarchies of power and knowledge that strongly influence the histories we recognize. These hierarchies also shape the institutions and the structures of our societies. So the way we see the future depends on what we understand about the past. Currently, we have no shared vision for what we should strive for in a climate-warming world. Efforts to impose programs that don't account for local understandings of what has been experienced can undermine resilience while professing to promote it. This leads to increasing inequity and failures to adequately address climate change impacts already underway. Here, I hope to add a transdisciplinary perspective that examines climate, environmental, and oral history with an example from Southwestern tribal lands. But I appreciate that the other work that I did on the Crow Nation was also included in the opening remarks. I include some of my personal experiences, as well as knowledge gained from working and living on Native American lands, first as a family member and a mother, and later as a scientist. I appreciate the honor of speaking today, and I hope that others will engage in similar conversations, because despite the lack of dialogue around climate change adaptation, we are going to have to adapt. But first, it's essential to provide background information about who is Native American and what I refer to as Indigenous people. Indigenous people live all over the world in a diverse range of ecosystems and biomes, where much of the world's biodiversity remains. They're estimated to number some 370 million people and represent the greater part of the world's cultural diversity, including the major share of the world's almost 7,000 languages. Many have experienced historical colonization, and many have also faced subjugation, dispossession, and marginalization. Some Indigenous people in the United States and elsewhere have also been pressed into areas with harsher living conditions, such as desert regions and drylands, but also mountain recesses and remote coastal and island regions. This puts many Indigenous people on the front lines of climate change. In recent decades, the tendency has been for people, especially from younger generations, to leave their Indigenous homelands for urban areas. And this is not just occurring in the United States, but in many areas around the globe, such as Nicaragua, Greenland, and Nepal. But wherever Indigenous people are, they maintain social and cultural traits that are distinct from dominant society, and these could include social organization, political and legal systems, and spirituality and worldviews. Terms used to designate Indigenous people vary considerably with place, social context, and historical moment. In the United States, there are currently 574 federally recognized tribes who are recognized or considered Native nations, Native American, or American Indian. Being federally recognized as a tribe or American Indian are legal terms. Policy and political experts sometimes struggle with these stipulations due to the colonial nature of their origins. Indigenous people in the United States and the US occupied territories, though, are not all considered federally recognized tribes or recognized groups. Under the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, the Office of Indian Affairs created a process whereby the government dictated tribal recognition. And after formalization of procedures in 1978, federal recognition requires a record of engagement in treaties, lawsuits, policy enactments with the US government. And federal recognition of many different tribes, while attesting to the diversity of people in the US, has had the unintended effect of instilling a perception that each tribe is a monolith without cultural, familial, and other relations with other tribes. Blood quantum, while not a topic of this lecture, has also led to misperceptions about racial purity. And I would suggest anybody who's interested in that topic to look at Kimberly Tallbear's work, as she has done an exceptional job of laying out some of the issues. Additional misperceptions come from the views that Native people are simply another minority group, or that Native people live in perfect harmony with their environments. To explain my perspective, it may be useful to share that when I was young, I had the opportunity to become a silversmith. And I left my reservation border town on the Wyoming-Montana border. And in my job, I became acquainted with a young Navajo man who was really bad at silversmithing. And if you're Native, you never pass up an opportunity to tease, which I did relentlessly. And we got to know each other, and we got married. And moved to the Hopi partition lands in northeastern Arizona, where his family was from. These lands were set aside historically by an executive order in 1882 as reservations for all the Hopis or other such Indians as the Department of Interior will settle thereon. In fact, that house that my husband's grandmother lived in had a front door view of the village of Aridity. And this village is known for its long and continuous occupation by Hopi people. What is less well known are some of the oral histories and clan origins of the Navajo people who also lived on these lands, often referred to as Black Mesa, in close familial relationships with Hopi people. The first official record of Navajos living on the Hopi Mesas is from 1540. Don Francisco Vasquez de Coronado and his soldiers visited the village of Arrivy and noted that Navajos were present at that time. In future visits to the Hopi Mesas, Spanish explorers and missionaries communicated with Hopi residents who spoke Navajo. And when my first son was born, his great-grandmother, Cheshinezbitsa, Tall Apache's daughter, named him Ashki Bahajonia, beautiful boy, and explained that his fair skin came not just from me, but from his Spanish ancestry, because her mother had Spanish and Hopi parentage, while her father, Tall Apache, had Apache relatives, as many people in the Black Mesa region do, such as the Chisha clan, who are the Chiricahua clan of Navajo people. Other Navajo clans with Hopi roots include the Tobacco clan ancestors of Navajo people in Tisto and Jedito, who trace their ancestry back to the village of Owatavi, where Spanish missionaries and Hopi inhabitants who lived there expelled the other Hopi villagers in the year 1700. Additionally, people from the Hopi Salt clan rescued and eventually married some Navajo people who fled from Utes who had attempted to capture them and sell them to the Spanish as slaves. This is the origin story of the Navajo Salt clan. These are but a few examples of clan origins, matrilineal family groups, tracing back to Puebloan people. There are also clan histories related to the Anasazi. The word Navajo itself is likely a Tewa term, or Navajo is translated to large cultivated fields and refers to the homeland of Navajo people. Clan origins are numerous, but major clans include the Nakai-Dene, the Mexican clan, the Mai-Dishkijni, Coyote Crossing clan from Chaco Canyon, and additional clan origins of Navajo people living on the outskirts of the Rio Grande Pueblos include those released from Spanish captivity and conflicts as early as 1599 from the Pueblo of Acoma, and from the 1680 Pueblo revolt against the Spanish missionaries When Don Diego de las Vargas returned in reconquest after that revolt, many people who were living in the Rio Grande Pueblos also fled in fear to join Navajos living in Deneta. Navajos warned Hopi villages of de Vargas's approach. In summary, Navajo clans themselves attest to a long history of intertribal relations, alliances with Puebloan people and families and groups of those displaced during conflict and surviving war refugees, all joined together and became Navajo people. There are similar stories in other oral tribal histories about displaced people finding refuge among indigenous people all across the US and undoubtedly elsewhere. At the time that the US established the New Mexico Territory in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Dene, or Navajo, were a flexible, mobile, and adaptable people. The nature of Navajo origins may also explain why the Navajo or Dene Nation grew over the same time that other groups were losing their populations. In this way, the Hopi explanation that Navajos became a distinct group when the Spanish arrived in the Southwest is consistent. What is problematic is the mysterious appearance of Navajo people in the Southwest by archaeologists who see Native people as inhuman artifacts of the past. When reflecting on the origins of resilience, I think about these family groups and these family origins, and the community and cultural networks that have served Native people in their adaptability and mobilization to seek out the favorable aspects of the environment in ever-changing conditions. These aspects of Native oral histories provide insights about how resilience is central to Native cultural frameworks. Native people all have migration stories and recognition of connections to other indigenous relatives. For example, the Crow people are related to the Hidatsa in the not-so-distant past, and also to the Kiowa. Many have matrilineal clans and that also provide information about Native alliances and intermarriage. The history of associations, alliance, and mobility explain how people survived, and the source of resilience that was later undermined during the history of US expansion. The Navajo landscape itself, with its inaccessible canyons and precipitous cliffs, was a refuge for people evading military conquest, while access to remote mountainous regions nearby provided sustenance. By the time the New Mexico Territory was established, there had been 250 years of slave raiding and conflict with the people of New Spain, Spanish conquistadors, and missionaries. Although the Dene had been primarily farmers, they transformed into an increasingly pastoralist society because they required mobility for safety, and their food crops were routinely burned. So the photo on the right there is a churro sheep, and they're distinctive sheep that are now only exist in the Southwest, although they originally came from the Mediterranean. And they have the rams have a very distinctive four horns. The newly acquired sheep and goats diversified in food sources, but could never get too large without attracting the attention of invading forces and settlers competing for livestock forage. When Kit Carson was authorized by the US Army under Brigadier General James Carleton to round up and force the surrender of the Dene, he shot Navajo men and their sheep, but he also destroyed crops and orchards and poisoned water supplies as people evaded troops. And to subjugate the Dene, he used tactics that had similarly been employed by the Spanish. Still, the resulting surrender of Navajo people did not include everybody, as some were able to live on Hopi mesas and beyond in remote canyon recesses. When the starving Dene surrendered in 1864, they were forced-marched on the Long Walk to Bosque Redondo. The policy applied then had been set by the Trail of Tears, experienced by the Cherokee people in the 1830s. Those imprisoned subsequently became part of a plantation-style labor force to build a military fort and grow crops for the soldiers stationed there. Taking these different modes of subjugation together was one of the many efforts to remove and isolate indigenous people from their land. The plantation model was not successful in this case because the climate of the southwestern US that Army generals were not familiar with was much different than the climate of the southeast, where slave-based agricultural practices were successful. Drought, hail, and worms destroyed the crops at Bosque Redondo, and the civilian agent working in the area called the project inhumane and unfruitful. And meanwhile, the War Department bill for the project was difficult to justify, amounting to $1,115,000 during the first 20 months. The Civil War had ended, leaving war deficits, and federal budgets were slashed. By 1868, the costly internment of Navajo people was increasingly questioned. There were also efforts by the governor and citizen editorials to uphold the abolition of Indian slavery in New Mexico Territory. Insufficient allocation for blankets and goods and for supplies to those imprisoned resulted in some held there wandering off in search of food, wood, and water. This is actually a photo from, oops, go back. This is a photo from Bosque Redondo showing the shelters that people had for themselves. So government correspondent recommended that Navajo could be self-sufficient if supplied with 40,000 sheep and provided a location with adequate wood and water. When people were finally able to return to their homeland, they were greeted and welcomed by their relatives. They also received livestock from the US government, though not 40,000 head. By the time Navajo people were freed, the 1862 Homestead Act had spurred an influx of people who had joined the former New Spain livestock owners in taking up occupation in the most verdant areas of traditional Navajo homeland. Moreover, the amount of land set aside in the 1868 reservation for Navajos returning from the Long Walk was insufficient. So this is the 1868 reservation land right there on the Arizona-New Mexico border. And the redder areas here are drier and warmer, and the greener areas are cooler and wetter. The process of surveying and establishing additional land was complicated by conflicts with settlers, railroad land grants, and the impossible demarcation of land among tribes. Since the reservation lands that were cobbled together over time and ultimately set aside had these difficulties in becoming established, Navajo populations, the Navajo populations were sufficiently large and the land was sufficiently harsh that most of it was never allotted, as most other reservation lands were. There was no way to do that. There were just too many people on too few resources to allot the reservation, except over here. And what the Navajos refer to now as the checkerboard, that's the only area of the reservation that's allotted. So the competition for land was fierce, and efforts to extend the reservation into more productive areas in New Mexico or Arizona, such as areas down here and here, were blocked by citizens who wanted to raise livestock there themselves, and finally by congressional action in 1918. So the government policy promoted was for Navajos to become self-supportive by raising sheep, and thereby reducing federal expenditures. But agency reports from the early life of what remained of Navajo territory in the late 1800s include many horrific accounts of starvation, even while government reports wildly inflated the numbers of livestock in Navajo possession. There were no verified counts of data collected about actual numbers of livestock in Navajo possession from federal agents before the 1930s, and the government's surveys of conditions were reported by those who didn't travel far beyond the periphery of their outposts. No considerations seem to have been made about the age of maturity or breeding capacity of sheep or the productivity of herd culls that were purchased by the Army for distribution to people who were starving. As in the Examination of Conquest narratives by Matthew Restall, we see historical writings nevertheless repeat older pronouncements, in this case about exploding livestock populations. Accounts are retold without asking the nature of the information or why it was disseminated. Despite the lack of data, some 20th century writers have insisted that the unsubstantiated numbers of livestock are evidence of Navajo thievery. While starving Navajo certainly did rustle livestock for food, and battles over livestock were a feature of conflict. Despite widespread hunger, Dene survived but did not all live within reservation boundaries, relying on the areas where they could continue to hunt, gather, and grow crops within the 4 sacred mountains that define their traditional homeland. And a land parcel that was set aside in 1901, right there, for Navajo people and for an Indian agency at Loop, Arizona, established a project to teach Navajo people how to farm as an agricultural enterprise. However, government farming demonstration efforts failed for many years running. The resulting frustration was communicated in a 1915 Loop Indian Agency report, where the agent also reported that virtually every Navajo family had at least an acre of corn and squash that they were growing on their own. It's symbolic of the ways that local knowledge and adaptability are somehow invisible to others, or undermined for the sake of control and marketization. Native agriculture is but one aspect of traditional knowledge. Many crops of the Americas expanded the types of foods available around the world and alleviated hunger in Europe and China at the onset of the Columbian Exchange. There are tens of thousands of varieties of corn, hundreds of thousands of potato varieties, and tomatoes, which can grow near the margins of the Atacama Desert. And there are peanuts and chocolate or cacao. The varieties of crops and the ways of growing them could ensure the food types might be able to adjust with changing climatic conditions. An example from the Peruvian Quechua is the establishment of agroecological pathways for seed exchange along elevational gradients. These crops could be endangered, though, if indigenous people who grow them can't maintain their connections to the land. Seed vaults can preserve seeds, but the seeds stored there may not be selected for the coming climate changes. For many Native nations, traditional crops and gathering traditional foods is bound to their identity. In the Southwest, indigenous agricultural methods are similar to what John T. Hack described and observed in the 1940s in his work for the Peabody Museum at Harvard, taking advantage of fluvial hydrology and the moisture-holding capacity of sandy sediment. And this is an example of some of the things that he described in his work. And this is a sand dune that's taking advantage of the moisture-holding capacity of sand to keep the moisture on the surface because they're so permeable and hold moisture so well. And this practice was still common in the 1970s and is sometimes seen even in recent times, even while a multi-decadal drought is underway. Meanwhile, the efforts at mainstreaming agricultural projects using mechanization are still of limited value in Navajo land, but are promoted due to the need to prove capacity of irrigable land and retain water rights. While small-scale agriculture was common up until the late 1970s, Dene pastoralism has become increasingly rare. Sheep herding was favorable in the early 20th century. Oh, here we go. Especially during the unusually wet conditions after 1915 until the 1930s. So that's this time here. So this is from 1899 to 2010. And all of the bars above this line, which is normal conditions, are precipitation anomalies where there's above average moisture. And the green bars below that line are below average moisture. So during the time here, reservation borders hadn't been clearly established, nor had grazing districts and a permit system. People were able to move their animals depending on local conditions and family connections. And higher amounts of summer monsoon rainfall provided grasslands with such ample moisture that smaller animals, sheep and goats, were hard to find in the tall grass. However, the 1930s were drier, and a drought famously produced the Great Plains Dust Bowl. In 1934, the Taylor Grazing Act was passed, and efforts to tamp down soil erosion led to work by the Soil Erosion Service to control livestock grazing. And much of what follows is portrayed in Marcia Weisiger's book, Dreaming of Sheep in Navajo Country, when grazing reduction was brought to Deneta. But some of what is not explained, however, is how the new grazing restrictions undermined the matrilineal-based pastoralism and destroyed local knowledge practices by placing permits with men in a regimen that restricted movement and reciprocal sharing among kinship groups. When dry conditions followed the widespread slaughter of sheep and goats, correlation between the disrespect of life, culture, and tradition was forever equated with the implementation of grazing restrictions and a progressively warming and drying climate. More recently, in the 20th century, the passage of the 1974 Navajo Hopi Settlement Act by Congress aimed at dividing reservation lands among the Hopi, Navajo, and Paiute tribes. My family was one of the many to be relocated from the Hopi partition lands, HPL. Although some of my in-laws refused to move. Over the years, the reservation has become a maze of fence lines that have been resurveyed and redrawn, occasionally forcing people to move, and at times with dire consequences. On one such occasion, my husband's great-aunt died because she was too little to travel during the forced removal of people. In other cases, reservation lines allotting land to different tribes overlapped. And our situation was further complicated by the Bennett-Freeze Act. In 1934, the US government reclarified the western boundary of the Navajo Nation for Navajo and all such Indians that may be located thereon. And this language created ambiguity over the possession of an area of land primarily inhabited by Navajos. The litigation between the Navajo and the Hopi occurred as a result, and the Hopi tribe sought extensive land, mineral, and water rights. As a result, in 1966, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Robert Bennett, ordered a freeze of development of a 1.6 million acre area in the western portion of the reservation. Over here. And the people who lived in the Bennett-Freeze area were then described in a 2004 US Senate Committee of Indian Affairs report as the poorest of the poor. During the 40 years it was in effect, the Bennett-Freeze mandated an embargo on infrastructure development in an area and affected local communities and contributed to poor living conditions for thousands of residents who managed to remain there, while many ultimately chose to leave. We eventually moved to Flagstaff, Arizona, and so I began my studies in environmental science at Northern Arizona University. And after completing my work there and subsequent graduate work, I returned to the Navajo Nation to conduct studies of my own. The reason for raising the importance of this history is that Native people live under a maze of federal bureaucracy that can justifiably limit the trust people have in government. Lives have been upended by the result of land use policies, but nevertheless, people have relied on each other for support. While my husband, children, and I left the joint use area, it was, as this area was then called, this area here, and we somehow managed, many others chose to stay. If one's life consists primarily of Diné culture and language and on traditional livelihood and subsistence practices, you're not likely to take up residence elsewhere, nor should you want to leave. Choices are also limited, especially by older generations who are only proficient in the Navajo language. These conditions have been met by intergenerational family connections and networks, keeping people connected as much as they can, but they have become more tenuous over time, and people have had fewer and fewer resources available to them. As more people are likely to be relocated for shoreline retreat and other similar relocation programs, it's important to consider the cultural, social, and economic aspects of what historically similar actions show. When I was hired to work as a geochemist at the federal government, I learned about, it was during a period of time when things were really changing within the federal government. And I was thrown in with a bunch of people who were working on paleoclimatology, because the group the paleoclimatology group was actually being reorganized into a bigger government group. And so I had a chance to talk to them and learn about what they did. And this was really enlightening to me because climate change had barely registered in the geology classes that I took as a college student. And the media also weren't covering aspects of climate change, even though it was quietly discussed among federal scientists. They were warned about speaking about it publicly during the Bush administration. And the realization about expected climate change impacts changed my research goals when I got there, and I began to compile data to look at the current landscape conditions of the Navajo Nation. So my objective was to find a baseline of conditions to compare with future changes. But what I found was that changes were likely already underway. The declining availability of snow and water and surface water became very evident by talking to people about their observances and then compiling old US Geological Survey reports to corroborate the time frame. Observations compiled during work also included local knowledge about changes to soil moisture and changing wind energy that would be very difficult to model. And these also included really important aspects of ecosystem change and cultural resources that people noted because they were important to them. The names of places also began to make more sense to me when looking at surficial geologic maps. One example is an area where we had lived on the reservation called Tulani Lake Chapter. And Tutlana, means many lakes. And it's a hot, dry, and dusty area now, but the surface is composed of silty lake deposits. And an old photo of geologist Herbert Gregory from the early 1910s, standing by a lake in the same area, provided additional evidence that even before the wet period of the 1920s, in northeastern Arizona, water was more plentiful. I also began to work to map out the distribution of sand dunes that commonly occur on the Navajo Nation. And I did this because they're sensitive indicators of wind energy and soil conditions. They're also important for their permeability and moisture holding qualities, as I mentioned before, for agriculture, but also as grassland ecosystems. So this area in here is where the sand dunes are stable and the grass is growing on them. And they're linear in shape. The wind is blowing this way. And I could see that the dunes were changing character, as in these areas where there's no longer vegetation growing and the dunes are freely mobilized by the wind. So I decided that making a map of the dunes that also provided the climatic conditions would help me understand what I was seeing. And so the areas that are wetter again and cooler are in green. This is Flagstaff, Arizona, and Farmington to New Mexico here, and Blanding, Utah. And so this is years of drought. The lighter areas are colored areas. What surprised me, though, about these maps was the incredible demarcation of drier and more arid conditions with reservation boundaries. Overall, the average annual precipitation on the Navajo Nation is 1/3 of the sacred mountain regions of traditional Navajo homeland, and the average annual temperature is 7 degrees C warmer. And in 1934, as these reservation boundaries were finalized, it forced Navajo people on the periphery into the reservation's less productive areas, resulting in higher populations living under harsher conditions. And these stresses of limited resources were then later magnified by the passing of the Navajo Hopi Resettlement Act that resulted in an additional disposition of people moving out of Hopi partition lands here to the other side of the fence line where they had Navajo relatives, because they clearly didn't have the option to leave given their adherence to traditional culture and language. And sand dune movement in these areas, especially when it's redder and darker like that, is a concern. This ratio of P to PE is used a lot in dune studies to quantify the climatic conditions that promote sand dune movement, because it is a proxy for the amount of vegetation that can grow on sand dunes and buffer the surface from wind erosion. So when the P to PE gets below certain thresholds, the amount of vegetation that grow subsequently changes. And during the drought, these threshold lines almost encompass the entire portion of tribal lands here, which is cause for concern. And these yellow lines here are actually soil moisture levels below which no vegetation is going to survive. So that is part of the reason that you have actively mobile sand dunes in these areas. And with the climate model projections of people like Richard Seeger in his publication in 2007 about an imminent warmer and drier Southwest, and just what we know about increasing aridity with warming temperatures, this is cause for concern because this is happening in drought conditions already. Oops. So this is what sand dunes look like when they become partly active. The crests lose their vegetation first because this is the drier, windier part of the sand dune. And then that part of the sand dune begins to blow, and then subsequently other parts of the sand dune can move. And then when you get below the aridity index where no vegetation can grow, that's when you have freely mobile sand dunes that look more like what you would see in a picture from Saudi Arabia or a place like that, right? What we more think about more generally as sand dunes. And Navajo and Hopi lands have been seeing increasing sand and dust resulting from the current climatic conditions, with more dunes moving and forming during the latter half of the 20th century, with or without any livestock grazing. The drought conditions have persisted on tribal lands of Hopi and Navajo since 1996 up to the present. And in the first years of my job documenting these changes, tens of thousands of Navajo livestock died. People tried to sell their livestock at widely held auctions across the reservation, but many could not recoup the amount of money they spent getting their animals to market. And I spent time in Window Rock talking to people there and explaining what the current conditions might portend for climate change and further warming, and in the local communities where I was working. And the news was not welcomed. Not at all. The many people living in more remote communities listened attentively, but I remember one exchange with a tribal employee who exclaimed, "What am I going to do with this?" And it was hard to understand at the time because I felt like, this is important. I have to really get the message across. But I've come to really appreciate the sentiment, because with all the stresses felt by Navajo people, who would want to know there could be more ahead, right? It's just not a popular thing to talk about. And what I was being confronted with as a scientist and a person from the community, severely affected by drought, was an intersection of settler colonialism's legacy with climate change-induced warming. And as someone with training as a physical scientist, and as someone from the community, I hadn't heard of these terms used to describe the social, historical, and political nature of the disaster, but I've come to know the forces intimately, nevertheless, and very personally. So assessing how much the current climatic conditions translate into sand and dust storms and dwindling water resources and stresses to ecosystems and livelihoods was a challenge, especially because of the historical dependence on dune ecosystems as grasslands for grazing livestock. And this dependence has led many to blame the sand and dust mobility on the people who live in these harsh areas, some of whom had to continue to rely on small herds as a supplement for wage work or their disability payments. Because of the driest part of the year is also the hottest, and people in parts of the Navajo Nation have to haul water from dwindling water supplies during heat waves, there were and continue to be significant worries about heat-related mortality. But under perilous drought conditions, Native people persist on reservation lands in the Southwest. and many have discontinued grazing. And as the drought has lengthened, there simply hasn't been enough water. But youth groups have organized, and nonprofits have joined in. They've worked together and with me on restoring grasslands in some of the worst affected areas and where elders live, as well as near their own homes and near their own relatives. Still, there's a high exposure of people in the US to climate extremes, and these efforts are really small compared to the challenges faced ahead. Fence lines, growing divisions among people, the lack of financial capacity and resources are all challenges to climate adaptation. Moreover, the question is not whether Native people can build resiliency, but whether the source of resiliency can be understood and supported rather than supplanted. Clint Carroll, in 2015, wrote a book, Roots of Our Renewal, and it offers a similar history of resiliency in which the Cherokee Nation developed an ethnobotany program. He documents the way the Cherokee elders used their cultural relationships to the land and all living things to maintain traditional practices and develop local connections to new lands after dispossession resulting from the Trail of Tears. While challenges for Native scientists and community-led work can come from highlighting some of the social and cultural perspectives of communities that are at odds with conventional studies, these aspects of knowledge are really important. There are many ways of viewing natural systems, and there are real ways that our landscapes are shaped by political ecology. There are also differences between tribal government employees, tribal members, knowledge keepers to navigate and understand, and relationships built on cooperation among these groups require trust and respect. Traditional aspects of caring for others and working together for community well-being are central to successful efforts. Although each distinct place has its own history, its own landscape, and its own local knowledge. These characteristics can inform the process required to build objectives for adaptation planning. They can serve to build local efforts for communities that are still not sure what their goals for the future should be. The sharing of local knowledge occurs through social organization. It's grounded in spirituality, in rituals and worldview. And to me, it's these aspects of Indigenous knowledge that require a better understanding, because the subsistence practices themselves, without these additional aspects, tied to community and reciprocity, is much the same as a human body without its heart. Reciprocity in traditional worldviews is not about resource conservation, but about recognizing the interdependency of all beings, including valuing the role of women and other genders in society, as well as children and the elderly. In learning about what changes people had observed on the Navajo Nation, it was not just about the climate that people talked about. It wasn't just the climate that had changed to them. Some of the most common remarks were about the loss of community and reciprocity that allowed people to work together to live through changes they had experienced. Subsistence practices are not only about what nature provides, but also about what communities and families do to support one another. As we now live in the dawn of the age of artificial intelligence, I would argue here that knowledge is more than about a particular subset of actions related to the way that humans live within and interact with the world. Although Indigenous knowledge includes knowledge about ecosystems, the framing of knowledge as mostly ecological may have come from the focus on agriculture, forest, and ecosystem management, such as the perspective of Burke's in his ecological studies in Indigenous Canadian communities. However, Burke's also noted when Inuit participants in a 1995 conference were asked to describe traditional knowledge, there was a consensus on the following meanings: practical common sense, teaching and experience through generations, knowing the country, being rooted in spiritual health, a way of life, an authority system of rules for resource use, respect, obligation to share, wisdom in using knowledge, and using the heart and head together. Resilience implies that an entity, community, or population has the ability to rebound after experiencing some stress or shock, and is characterized by the ability to persist. Within the disaster risk community, resilience is seen as the opposite of vulnerability. I would argue here that resilience is an outcome of the cultural traits that have allowed people to adapt and live even in difficult conditions. Increasingly, Indigenous groups in the United States are embracing the local knowledge that remains within their communities. I've published my own work based on conventional scientific analysis and tribal elder consultations with Clara Kelly and Harris Francis. And that work resulted from our climate vulnerability project on the Navajo Nation. The physical science record corroborated the observations of people and allowed them to gain an acknowledgement of their own experiences. We established climate impacts in a region without adequate meteorological monitoring, where the questions of people who are coping with the conditions have been ignored. As such, we distilled accounts into specific information about water and forage availability, as well as changes to livelihoods. However, these publications don't include many of the details necessary to describe how the cultural and colonial histories are reflected in the knowledge and perspectives of people. The why and the how knowledge is passed down from generations who lived through so much environmental and social change doesn't fit into technical science reports or technological innovations. Collaborative efforts to produce scientific studies on tribal lands are built on trust and working towards shared research goals. Without recognizing the sources of resilience and knowledge in Native communities, we don't understand how vulnerabilities result and what policies limit access to cultural and natural resources. Work to document changes and understand climate change requires we recognize historical inequities and the unaddressed needs of people. But the importance of traditional knowledge is that it provides a perspective on the environment and the world that includes finding ways for people to center well-being during times when coming together to solve problems seems more difficult than ever. It requires, though, that we appreciate what humans can accomplish by using our connections to each other, and as well as our different ways of knowing the world. Thanks. So I believe Clint is scheduled to come up next. So welcome Clint to the podium.
Osio Nigadawo, Ukahati Sequanio, Hadawado, Ale Galie Liga, Jigedo Akohiga. Hello, everyone. I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm honored to be in dialogue with Dr. Redsteer. This won't be too much of a surprise for Margaret, because we had the good fortune of being able to grab a meal last night together, and it was a wonderful conversation. I also wanted to say that I'm just honored to share the stage in this event with Rebecca Sosi and Phil Deloria. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the Tanner Committee for selecting me as a respondent. Dr. Redsteer presents an enlightening discussion on the resiliency of Native peoples in the face of the compounding effects of colonialism and climate change, especially focusing on the source of resilience that resides in the moral frameworks, community care, cultural practices, and relational worldviews of Indigenous peoples. She views the contemporary challenges of Indigenous communities through both her training as a climate scientist and through the historical and contemporary experiences of family and extended community, specifically regarding her in-law relatives on the Navajo reservation. Her argument is clear and direct, that the current systems used to understand and respond to the effects of climate change are inadequate for addressing the environmental challenges of that many Indigenous peoples face today. Further, she argues that these very systems of dispossession and marginalization inhibit the ability of all peoples to adapt and potentially flourish in a rapidly changing world. In my response, I'd like to sit with two sets of coupled terms and think through their meaning in relation to the themes of Redsteer's lecture. Specifically, one, climate change and colonialism, and two, resilience and thresholds. In the time I have left, I hope to engage with Dr. Redsteer's insistence on both mitigation and adaptation forums, with a call for the indigenization of adaptation inspired by her writing. On climate change and colonialism, or forced removal as climate change and climate change as forced removal. As many scholars in Indigenous environmental studies have argued, there is a direct relationship between colonialism and climate change. This assertion plays out on several registers. For one, many Indigenous peoples experienced a form of climate change due to colonial dispossession from their homelands. This experience is analogous to the rapid changes many Indigenous communities must contend with today, in the sense that it was imposed and that it created the need to adapt to drastically different conditions under duress and in the context of violent acts that sought to eliminate them. For example, as a result of forced removal from our homelands to what is now called Oklahoma, Cherokee people lost access to at least 1/3 of the wild plants we used for medicine, food, and other cultural uses. Our ancestors also had to adapt food crops to accommodate climatic conditions that differed significantly from our homelands in the Southeast. Further, colonial constrictions on Indigenous mobility through the establishment of reservations effectively severed ties with expansive ancestral homelands and limited their adaptive capacity within the demarcated islands of land to which they were now confined. And even further, as Heather Davis and Zoe Todd assert, colonial relations to land, specifically proto-capitalist forms of extraction and accumulation by dispossession, directly informed the very actions and logics that, quote, continue to shape the world we live in and that have produced our current era, end quote. Climate change is the result of colonial land relations and is causing the repeated removal of Indigenous peoples, not only in the literal relocations of communities due to rising sea levels and melting permafrost, but also in the sense that within the colonial confinements of reservations, Indigenous peoples have lost or actively losing access and the accompanying caretaking that in plants they seek to gather must grow that may affect their future health and existence. And yet, even while we see in this framing that A, colonialism and its relations to land are the source of climate change, and B, colonial policies seek to eliminate Indigenous peoplehood and their relations to land, as Redsteer points out, Indigenous communalism and land-based relations solutions to the climate crisis require anti-colonial action. So I'll return to the latter point at the end of my remarks. On resilience and thresholds, or the logical traps of adaptive capacity. Continuing the discussion on the enduring effects of colonialism, I can't help but think of Cheyenne Arapaho writer Tommy Orange's commentary on resilience in one of the interludes to his 2018 novel, There, There. He writes, quote, "The wound that was made when white people came and took all that they took has never healed. An unattended wound gets infected, becomes a new kind of wound, like the history of what actually happened became a new kind of history. All these stories that we haven't been telling all this time, that we haven't been listening to, are just part of what we need to heal. Not that we're broken. And don't make the mistake of calling us resilient. To not have been destroyed, to not have given up, to have survived, is no badge of honor. Would you call an attempted murder victim resilient?" End quote. This pointed critique of the term resilient belies the complexity that Redsteer's analysis offers. Yet, nonetheless, it illuminates the need to explicate the conditions under which Indigenous resilience operates. As Redsteer shows, although Native people possess an inherent resiliency that is informed by moral frameworks of interdependency and reciprocity, and that manifests in the refusal to abandon them for dominating and exploitative ones, there are limits to resilience, both in how Native communities enact it and in how we use the word. And I'm thinking here of the difference between what we might call or might describe as bounce back resilience versus interrupted resilience. The former assumes a return to a previous state. The latter still demonstrates resilience, but in a stunted form due to an obstruction in the path of return. In this visualization, it's still possible to celebrate our resilience as Indigenous peoples, as we often do, while recognizing that the placement of the obstacle inhibits the ability to rebound fully. This, I think, is the source of Orange's cynicism, but also the object of Redsteer's critique. As Redsteer asserts, the question of how much disturbance Native people can absorb is the wrong question. That question focuses on rationalizing the continuance of a violent system. And this calls to mind the work of Métis scholar and anti-colonial scientist Max Libroron, who in their 2021 book, Pollution is Colonialism, writes about the underlying colonial assumptions of thresholds as expressed in the theory of assimilative capacity. Briefly, assimilative capacity explains the ability of ecosystems to absorb pollution up to a certain threshold, beyond which the self-purifying capability of, for example, a riverine ecosystem is compromised. Libroron critiques the scientific concept of assimilative capacity for its assumed access to Indigenous land as a sink for pollution. In their words, quote, "Pollution is not a manifestation or side effect of colonialism, but is rather an enactment of ongoing colonial relations to land. That is, pollution is best understood as the violence of colonial land relations rather than environmental damage, which is a symptom of violence." End quote. Understanding the resilient capacity of Indigenous communities, then, requires the recognition of the violent systems and conditions that limit the full expression of Indigenous resiliency and adaptability. This is the crux of Redsteer's argument. So in the second half of my remarks, I return to the issue of anti-colonial action. Our communities have persisted and adapted, but our ability to do this is becoming more and more limited, largely because of the continuation of technocratic and extractive mindsets and activities, the impacts of which we see manifested in species extinctions, sea level rises, wildfires, droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events, the continued and increasing industrialized agricultural production, and the negative effects that this has on the health of the land, ecosystems, and the disenfranchised migrant workers and their families on whose backs this industry stands. and a rabid consumerism that always already assumes access to indigenous land as a sink for the resulting waste and byproduct pollution. What this tells me is that the obstructions to a fully realized resiliency for indigenous peoples are, in effect, obstructions to the resilient capacity of all peoples, and that the mutual flourishing of all life requires transformative approaches to our current ecological crisis that aren't couched in the logics and practices that have created it. This is why Indigenous studies and ethnic studies scholars spend a great deal of time talking about colonialism, because it's not just a historical occurrence that we can acknowledge and move on from. It is a particular way of understanding relationships to one another and the land that is baked into what are often taken for granted assumptions and practices. These assumptions and practices include the evils of extractive industry, as well as the many well-intentioned ideas and approaches to environmental science and environmentalism broadly. All are predicated on and serve to perpetuate a violent system. In Indigenous studies and ethnic studies, we also spend a great deal of time talking about relationality, and we are working to explain and theorize it in Indigenous and other marginalized community contexts. I use the term relationality as a way of thinking about, on the one hand, systems, structures, practices, and peoples that exist in relation to one another, as articulated by power relations or social relations. And on the other hand, kinship obligations and what it means to be a good relative. And this extends to the land, waterways, and more than human beings via Indigenous ontological and philosophical stances, and their manifest land-based knowledges and practices. Indigenous feminist scholars Melanie Yazzie and Kutcha Risling-Baldy theorize the latter of these two meanings as radical relationality, as they term it. Their theorizing of this term is informed by the long tradition of Indigenous feminisms, expressed both within scholarly and literary works by Indigenous women and from grounded community and activist contexts. Speaking of the impacts of extractive industry in Native communities, specifically the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives, they write, quote, "The interconnectedness between Indigenous women's bodies and the lands that women caretake constitutes one of the primary axes of relationality in Indigenous feminism," end quote. Redsteer makes a similar call for the expression of transformative approaches to climate crisis that consider gender, specifically the disproportionate impacts of violent systems of land management and control on Indigenous women. These impacts not only affected Native women's autonomy, but undermined many Indigenous governance systems that were based in matrilineal or matrifocal values and authority. Redsteer's assertion that now is a time for transformation underpins a radically relational vision of climate justice that recenters the role of women and values the contributions of other non-binary genders in contradistinction to the prevalence of heteropatriarchal authority in colonial systems. In closing, and building on Redsteer's assertion that we need to focus on both mitigation and adaptation in our efforts to cope with climate change, I resonate with her cautious optimism. As she states, mitigation proposals alone tend to overemphasize market-driven solutions and a sense of urgency that can steamroll over good relations. But when viewed through anti-colonial lenses, mitigation can help stem the tide of change and the harm to Indigenous communities who are among the most impacted. Activists and allies who have seats at the decision-making table can reject continued extractivism in favor of Indigenous land rights and can help reframe the world's approaches to conservation away from fortress models and toward Indigenous stewardship and guardianship. Scientists can model and enact place-based anti-colonial methodologies in their labs and work toward ethically informed knowledge production that supports Indigenous land relations. And again, I'm drawing from Max Lieberman's fantastic book, Pollution is Colonialism. As for adaptation, I would advocate for the indigenization of the term to stress the relational work that this will require. That is, instead of an adaptation to current and impending conditions that privileges narratives of Western scientific technological advancement, an indigenous approach to adaptation would refuse proposed solutions that are based in colonial thinking and instead emphasize the need to find ways to live amid profound change, drawing on what I call indigenous relational technologies. While narratives of Western science and technology have taken center stage as we confront the urgency and severity of climate change, solutions to the root problems lie in the ability of humans to shift our ethics in relation to the earth and other than human beings, as well as to each other. This shift will require us to draw on frameworks and practices of relationality guided by Indigenous teachings. It pushes us to reconsider not only how we view the role of technology, but how we understand that which constitutes technology itself. And we could call this little t technology. Relational technologies can work to counteract dominant technocratic narratives of control over and management of the earth, and instead to reinforce our roles and responsibilities as kin. Drawing on the work of Yuchi scholar Daniel Wildcat, rather than an outright rejection of technology, this approach would also view what we might call big T technology in its capacity to bring into balance our relationships with each other and the earth and the reciprocal obligations this requires. A redefinition of little t technology, along with the redefinition of our relationship to big T technology, reflects the simultaneously timeless and innovative ethos of relationality practiced by Indigenous communities that offers a critical counterbalance to the current preoccupation with Western scientific technological approaches to the climate crisis. Redsteer insightfully discusses the persistence of moral frameworks that inform Indigenous resilience, and that these moral frameworks can and should inform climate science and policy when employed in reciprocal relationship with Indigenous knowledge carriers, Indigenous scientists, and their respective communities. Scientists and policymakers should heed this call, but, as she asserts, not without re-examining the roots of the crisis and the foundation upon which their knowledge and assumptions sit. Wodo, thank you. I'm going to invite Dr. Redsteer back to the stage, and we'll have a seat. And if Dr. Redsteer wants to say any words in response, I'll open it up for that. Otherwise, we can launch into questions.
Thank you. I actually thought a lot about what Tommy Orange said in his book. They're there because it really is part of the reason I wanted to talk about resilience in the first place, is because people often get told that that's what we need to strive for, when so many Native people, that has just been the way people are living. I mean, it is really part of Native American life today. So thank you for that thought. And I'd love to hear what questions people have in the audience.
I think we have microphones to pass around if anyone wanted to.
I think this is.
Thank you so much for the lecture and the response to the lecture. They were both deeply informative. I'm wondering, as I'm listening to you, my mind is trying to think what the remedy is, what the repair is, and I'm sure many people here, their minds were trying to think of that. And I'm also aware that when newcomers, I mean, it's not the first time that I've, or that any of us probably have had to look at the, injustice and injury that you both describe. But one is always a kind of newcomer to it compared to those who have lived with it. And so when I try and think of solutions, and I'm sure when other people try to think of solutions, I'm aware that they're probably laughably inappropriate. And that kind of inhibits me from even trying to think of the solution. So I just wondered if, and I know you did sketch some things, I mean, very thoroughly, like replanting grasses and so forth. But I'm just wondering if it's possible to sketch remedies that are talked about in these places, and remedies that are also thought of as, the first thing newcomers like myself think of that are that we should be steered away from.
I'm not sure if this is working. It's working. Oh, great. Well, my initial thoughts are thank you first of all for that wonderful question, because I think that's something that we all struggle with. What do? We understand that there are these issues. And I think one of the things that is just part of human nature is we want to jump in with the ideas that we have. But a lot of times what we need to do is really start to listen to one another and learn a little bit more about each other's experiences and perspectives, because much of what we understand about the way a person lives on the land is going to depend on what we understand about history. As I mentioned in the beginning, our perspectives are built upon the history that we know. And that's going to be different than the perspectives and the experiences of somebody else who may be struggling with the day-to-day living in the region where they're being affected. And I think one of the big misunderstandings from the Navajo Nation for a long time is what is pastoralism and how did it even come about? And many people don't recognize that it was actually encouraged by the federal government for many, many years. And in fact, up until the 1930s and grazing reduction, there was no marketization of Navajo livestock because the government was really focused on bringing the numbers of livestock up. So when it finally became successful and the Great Plains Dust Bowl hit, everybody, then administrations changed and it was, no, you have too many animals. You need to reduce. And so a lot of times what happens essentially is there's miscommunication and people end up working at cross purposes to one another. And so without a shared vision and without patience to listen to one another, that's when I think we really end up with a lot of stumbling blocks. It really depends on being able to let go a little bit with your control over what you want to see done, I think.
Yeah, I would just pick up on that same note there as far as, I think it operates on a couple of different levels. One, as you're saying, there needs to be more open lines of communication that not only are listening, but as you say, are taking seriously Indigenous knowledge systems and the teachings that they have to offer. And so this is where scientific hubris and understandings of how knowledge is produced should be reconsidered and refashioned in ways that account for Indigenous and other than Western ways of knowing, as well as the ability of Indigenous nations and representatives from those nations to have seats at the table, and so that the translation doesn't have to go through multiple people in order to get to the top, basically. And so that's where I would pick up on your comment about the power relations and dynamics and acknowledging those in these discussions and where decisions get made. There's a question behind you.
Thanks to both of you for very interesting comments. I'm a geologist and a geochemist and a paleoclimatologist. So I'm glad you have interacted with my people. I have a question about whether resilience is the right word for what it is required for the years ahead. You know, resilience is recovery from disturbance. And yet, what I know about climate change tells me even if we do remarkable things in terms of reducing our emissions, the timescales of the Earth system, whether it's the oceans or the ice sheets or just the carbon cycle, the timescales are so long, most people don't appreciate the thing that we've already set in motion. It seems to me that we don't need resilience, we actually need something transcendental, we need something transformational.
Yes, we do.
And given that, I've spent a lot of time in New Mexico, and so I have enormous respect for Indigenous knowledge, and I was just in Delhi talking about the plight of Indigenous people in India. At the same time, I fear that sometimes we treat Indigenous knowledge with reverence without questioning the question of, it looks to me like Indigenous communities, just like our own communities, are not prepared for what is coming, because what is coming is nothing like what has happened in the past. I'm sympathetic to the view that you put forward, that it's the social connections that add to this adaptability, and yet we need more than that. And the question is, I'm concerned that Indigenous knowledge is not going to be sufficient for the true transformation that's going to be required in the decades ahead. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, that's wonderful. I really appreciate your question and your comments. Definitely we need more than resilience. There's no question about that. And I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Pelling's work, but I think that you would really appreciate his writing. He wrote a book about adaptation as transformation in a book back in 2011. And resilience is essentially an initial step in adaptation. It's about maintaining the status quo, but it's only an initial step so that we can start to transition to more meaningful, well, not more effective ways of adapting. So from resilience, you need to start really building stakeholder engagement and bringing in different views and different ways of looking at systems together in order to transition to transformation. So that's why I thought in my talk I would start talking about the fact that we're not working together and talking to one another, because if we want to start building past resilience to transition to transformation, the first thing is we have to start listening to one another and working together. And right now, I don't think this country is doing a very good job of that. And a lot of people around the world really aren't either. And until we can build that vision of what we want to do to move forward together, the transformational part is not going to be there. And in fact, resilience itself, maintaining the status quo, can actually be a feature of authoritarian governments. And so that is concerning, right? And it's concerning that is the buzzword now, because we need to start moving past resilience. But at the same time, having people come to your community and say, you need to build resilience when that's all you know, can also be a little bit hard to take. So that's sort of my perspective. Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I had some thoughts. I honestly don't know what's more transformational than the rejection of a mindset that has dominated the planet for the past 500 years. And I think that certainly we have to acknowledge that Indigenous knowledge systems are place-based, and that they kind of defy this universalizing tendency of Western science, which is a good thing. But I think there's value in understanding place and connection to place as something that can inform larger discussions around global climate change and adaptation or resilience, whatever you want to call it, that have a generalizability. And I'm drawing again from Liberon's work, and you can tell that I've read this book recently with my students, and I'm just all about it. But the idea that it's not about universalizing, it's about understanding the things that may apply in one location to another without the tendency to assume that they will completely map perfectly onto another place or onto a global scale. But yeah, I guess my knee-jerk reaction is I don't know what it is about the word transformation that you're not seeing with regard to what Margaret and I were saying with in relation to colonial systems, that is the moment of transcendence that we all need to get on board with. And I think that it's a call to action, but it's not assuming that it's going to happen overnight. But at the same time, I don't know what else there is to think about, or what other box there is to think outside when it comes to that question, to be quite honest. I do agree with you that like talking to each other is important, but then, in the context, under the context of acknowledging uneven power relations that have persisted since the dawn of colonialism. And that requires scientists to have a sense of humility.
Thank you both. I had a question for the scientist. You were telling us about desertification, essentially. And it occurred to me that most people in the United States have no idea what that is, that most of us are not threatened by that at all. So when we talk about climate change, we talk about sea level rise, because we all can sort of imagine that. So it did occur to me that, the indigenous peoples, especially you were talking about the Navajo Nation, have a lot to teach the rest of us about desertification. And it's another aspect of climate change we all need to learn about. Thank you.
Of course, it does depend on where you are geographically in the US. But yes, and there are tribes that are dealing with sea level rise as well. And in fact, they're getting money to move at this point and relocate, which I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. I was told that it's a hard stop at 5:45, so who's...
I do, yes. Yeah, hi, I'm David Carrasco, and I used to be at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and spent a lot of time there. So one of the things that I've studied over the years is indigenous cities, and especially the rise of urban life in Mexico and Guatemala. And one of the things that we find in these cities, even with indigenous values, is the destruction of the ecological base in some cases. And one of the things that I think I'd like to hear more in the discussion of colonialism is what are we going to do about the cities, which I think have the greatest impact, are the kind of the motors of the ecological disasters that we're in. Some of my other geological people can help me with this. But so I think that the case that you're making about colonialism, I certainly agree with that. But I don't know how we can go forward with a real critique unless we deal with the impact of urban life itself on all of this. I saw that in some of the slides. I think we saw Flagstaff and some other cities. But what are we going to do about this if we're going to really develop a critique of this ecological situation, unless we deal with the tremendous impact that the urban networks have done on the earth? So that's my concern about moving forward.
Well, one comment I would like to make I appreciate that remark is, you know, one of the things that we see worldwide, right, is that we're all becoming much more urbanized. People are moving out of rural areas into urban areas, and they're doing that in search of work right now. And a lot of times when they get there, they can't get work. Or in areas like Bangladesh, there are areas where there's a lot of sea level rise, and so people who were growing rice in the past can no longer grow rice there, and there are shrimp farms taking over where the rice growers used to be. And all of those people are then migrating into urban areas in search of work, and they end up living in urban slums, many of them. So that is also a feature of climate change, this rapid urbanization. And a lot of the urbanization, of course, is then coastal, because all of our largest cities are in coastal areas. And so many of the people who are moving into urban areas are then going to be dislocated with sea level rise and extreme weather. So I agree with you. It's an issue that needs to be looked at more holistically, because people in urban areas get their food and services and goods from everywhere else. And it's all a connected system. So I think it's a symptom of climate change just as much as it is a problem and a driver.
I'll just offer a very brief response just off the top of my head, thinking about, I mean, you opened up with, you know, indigenous cities, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that, you know, cities and urbanity aren't specific to Western civilization, right? And so I guess, you know, my immediate thought was, you know, how can we learn from indigenous city traditions, if you will, or histories, and understand, you know, limits to what an urban area might look like today, as well as thinking about, you know, countering on the other end of the spectrum some proposals for increasing the urbanization of the world because of the efficiency, the so-called efficiency that they represent with regard to transportation, you know, other services that people need to live. And I say this because I actually witnessed one of them, and it was at an interesting conference a few years back in Sausalito, California. And you know, the assumption was, we'll just take all this land to grow these giant cities, and that'll help solve the ecological crisis because of how efficient they are. And I think it was Charles Mann, who was there at the time, kind of ripped this guy a new one and said, "Whose land are you talking about taking?" You know, so I appreciated that critique, but you know, the assumption again of access to land to expand cities that may seem to be more sustainable, but in you know, again, it goes back to that mindset. It goes back to the assumption around you know, having the ability to grow or develop in ways that are supporting and sustaining colonial relations to land. Yeah. Thank you for the question. And I think I'm going to have to be the one who stops things. But thank you all.